And I wanted to spend just a few minutes here at the beginning just talking about our motivation for putting together our webinar series for the year. We will be offering 2 of these in the fall semester and then 2 again in the spring semester. Some of you may be familiar with communication across the curriculum, but just in case you are not, or this is the first time you've participated in one of our faculty development events, let me just give you a little bit of context. So as an institution, UNC Charlotte has committed to the idea that students in all disciplines across campus will have the opportunity to develop their communication skills as they matriculate through their college career. And this means both written and oral competencies that they'll have the opportunity to develop across time while they're here. And there are important reasons why the institution has committed to this. First of all, we know from learning research that developing communication competencies is a process. Students need the opportunity to practice it across time. It's not just a matter of taking one course and learning to write a paper, or one public speaking course and learning everything you need to know about how to interact and communicate verbally. So they need time to practice, develop, and apply these skills, and they need exposure to those throughout their college career. Secondly, research shows that using communication, both written and oral participation in the classroom, supports teaching, and it helps foster deep learning and engagement with the content, and it's positively correlated with greater student learning outcomes and student motivation. So we know that this is a good teaching practice, and there are different ways that we can get at that in the classroom. And then lastly, we also know that communication competencies feature prominently in terms of what employers are looking for. They prioritize communication skills, and this holds across sectors. And we want our students to be well equipped for success when they leave here, and to be able to communicate effectively in terms of their expectations of their discipline and their field, as well as more generally. So what CXC does in a nutshell is we are an on-campus support for the integration of communication across the curriculum. So we serve all academic departments, and we do this at different levels. We do this at the level of course design and individual instructional practices, such as what we're going to talk about today. And we also do this at the program level in supporting curricular conversations about how do we integrate those communication student learning outcomes across our curriculum, and not just concentrate them in one class or a couple of classes. So that's what we do. That kind of gives you some context for why we put on this webinar series for campus. Today we're going to be talking about one very specific instructional strategy, classroom discussion. And that's one way of many to integrate communication in the classroom. And I just want to highlight that our focus today is on face-to-face classroom discussion. However, a lot of the principles that we're going to be talking about you would find hold in online classrooms. However, you would want more detailed information on facilitating online discussion. Today our focus is face-to-face. There are a lot of resources, including the CTL provides excellent resources on facilitating online discussion that can supplement what we're talking about here today. So our goal today is for you to come away from this webinar ready. We want you to be able to walk into the classroom and hopefully apply some effective facilitation strategies and involve your students in that facilitation. So we are going to talk about these 3 main areas. We're going to talk about how to structure a productive conversation, classroom discussion. We're going to talk about practicing effective facilitation as a teacher. And then we're also going to talk about developing students as facilitators and ideas for how you might do that. So let's first turn to structuring a productive discussion. So what do I mean by discussion? All of us certainly have used classroom discussion. We've participated in classroom discussion, and we have probably a big broad idea of what this is. And essentially discussion it's a range of techniques that we can use in the classroom that emphasize participation, emphasize dialogue, and they emphasize two-way communication and interaction among students. The important thing to note about discussion is that it includes both course content as well as opportunities for students to develop their communication skills by sharing their opinions, ideas, and getting feedback in real time from their peers. So why do we use discussion? Why do we uphold this as a really good thing to do in the classroom? Again, research consistently points towards some positive academic outcomes with using discussion in the classroom, such as a positive correlation with increased student motivation, greater student learning, enhanced critical thinking and problem-solving skills, and improved communication skills. So there's a good basis there of research that says, yes, using discussion well can help us get at these things. These are improved outcomes that enhance our teaching and learning in the classroom. However, although we may acknowledge that discussion is a good idea and the value of it as an instructional strategy, few of us have a more in-depth understanding of what exactly teachers need to do as facilitators to get to those positive learning outcomes. So today, we're focused not on discussion for discussion's sake, because just saying that it's a good thing you ought to do, but rather we're going to talk more specifically about strategies that lead to greater student learning. Okay, so I want you to, just for a moment, think about and envision a productive classroom discussion. So take a moment, get a visual in your head of a productive classroom discussion, what that looks like. Hopefully everyone's getting some ideas there of what this looks like. I know my vision of an ideal productive classroom discussion is that students are participating, they're bouncing ideas off of each other, they're asking questions, building on each other's ideas. There's a lot of enthusiasm and participation across the board, right? Now, that's the ideal that I have in my head. Yours may be similar. You may have other things that you would add to that. I now want you to think about the constraints that you see to achieving this ideal. Perhaps you've tried discussion. Perhaps you've thought about it but are worried about certain constraints. So think about what keeps you from achieving that ideal, or why hasn't it worked, or why do you not think you could get to that? So some of the things you may be thinking about could be very real physical constraints, such as the size and type of the classroom. It could be participation issues, such as, well, if students haven't read, then how are they going to come and discuss? Or it could be that you've tried certain things and they haven't worked in the past. There are always constraints. There's no one ideal with what we're going to talk about today in terms of using discussion as a specific teaching strategy. So keep that in mind. But what we're going to talk about is a process for designing discussions intentionally and is integrated with your course learning outcomes. And so the process looks like this. You first want to determine the purpose of the discussion. Then you want to think about what communication behaviors you need to put into practice in order to practice competent facilitation. And then you want to choose specific facilitation strategies that align with both the purpose and your communication behaviors. So let's go back up to purpose for a moment. Excuse me. The very first step for structuring a productive and effective classroom discussion is determining the purpose, okay? And the way that you do this is you take a look at what are you trying to achieve? What are the learning outcomes that this discussion is helping you work towards, okay? So you may have course-level learning outcomes that are perhaps broken down into a module or a unit, and then for a specific day. You may be looking only at the course-level learning outcomes. I'm not so concerned here with what level you've broken these into. just that you are aligning the purpose of that discussion with a specific learning outcome or perhaps multiple outcomes. When you get to the level of planning for the day, for example, let me give you an example from one of the courses that I teach. I teach on a concept called strategic ambiguity. And this concept basically says that in organizations, sometimes people use ambiguity on purpose, right? They strategically use ambiguous messages. And my learning outcome for that day when we talk about strategic ambiguity is that I want students to be able to identify that when it happens and ask questions that lead them to understanding why managers, supervisors, others in organizations might intentionally be ambiguous when communicating organizational messages. So I then use discussion as a teaching strategy to help us work towards that learning outcome, that they can identify strategic ambiguity and that they can articulate why it's being used. So then I build my discussion very specifically and focused, excuse me, around that learning outcome. And then that leads you to the second part of this. What questions do you want to ask and why? So this is the foundation of building a structured discussion, is make sure that your purpose for that discussion is clear. And discussion may be only one way that you're getting at that learning outcome, right? It may support other teaching strategies you're using to get at that learning outcome, and that's okay. But what are you trying to do with the discussion, and where is it helping you move students forward on their learning journey? All right, I want to talk about communication behaviors and facilitation strategies, and we're going to break these up. So I'm going to move forward here and talk about teacher facilitation and communication behaviors. So oftentimes when we think about classroom discussion, we kind of jump right to thinking about cool techniques and strategies, and we're going to get to those in a moment. Those are really important, but my point that I can't reiterate enough is that you have to have that solid foundation. Purpose of your discussion, excuse me, how it aligns with your course learning outcomes. So let's talk now, before we get into strategies that you may use, or techniques that you might use in actually conducting the facilitation, let's talk about what it means to be a competent facilitator. Facilitation, you have to excuse me, I am going to take a drink of water. Excuse me for that. You have to keep in mind that facilitation is different than presentation, right? So when we are in our instructor role, we're in the classroom, and we're thinking, or we're using different teaching strategies, different instructional strategies throughout our class period. We may lecture, we may have mini lectures, mini presentations, we may have discussion facilitation, we may have other techniques that we use. But I want you to keep in mind that the role of the facilitator is different than the role of the presenter, right? Same audience in our class, but different purposes and different preparation for that role. So Finn and Schroet, researchers in communication education, recently did a study in 2016 where they identified what are the competent facilitation behaviors that teachers enact that correlate positively with these better student learning outcomes or greater student learning that we've been talking about. And they came up with 5. The first is to affirm, right, students, and this has to do with creating a supportive environment, affirming students' contributions, and using constructive feedback, right? Second is organizing, guiding and directing the conversation. This has to do with having a facilitation plan and the ability in real time to connect ideas and provide clear transitions, right? So it's not a free-for-all. You want students to discuss, but you also have a guiding plan that structures that conversation. The ability to provoke. This is to provoke deep thinking, perhaps even debate, but getting them to think about multiple perspectives on an issue is an important facilitation competency. And then your questions, right? Using effective questions and prompts. And I'm sure that you've heard this before, but when you enter into a discussion situation, you definitely want to focus on open-ended questions, and you want to use questions that are singular and focused. So not double-barreled, not 5 questions at once, right? Not overwhelming. You want to think about your entry points with your questions, and have them be really clear and focused. And then finally, the ability to correct, and this has to do with course correction. So classroom discussion is not a free-for-all. It's not that students just get to discuss and whatever comes up, comes up. There are times as a facilitator that you need to course correct, either bring them back onto topic or point out in a constructive way, in an affirming way, when information perhaps is just not correct or it's not in line with what you read. And there are, thinking about how you might do that in an affirming and constructive way helps you get at these effective facilitation techniques. Okay, and then lastly, what I want to talk about with practicing effective facilitation as a teacher is teacher immediacy. Again, you've probably heard of teacher immediacy. If you haven't heard that term, certainly you're practicing it. Teacher immediacy has to do with reducing the distance between student and teacher, instructor and teacher. And we think about this in terms of verbal immediacy and nonverbal immediacy. And why we talk about this in relation to facilitation is, again, facilitation is a different role than presenting, has a different purpose, and immediacy can help increase and enhance those effective teacher facilitation behaviors that we just talked about. So when we think about verbal immediacy, we're thinking about things like using students' names, encouraging student input and discussion. When we think about nonverbal immediacy, we're thinking about how you use the room and the space. We're thinking about eye contact, gesturing and smiling. And a lot of these behaviors tie into active listening, which is something that you want to practice as a facilitator. So when you are in the facilitation role, you are in the role of keeping the process, right? You're keeping the process of the conversation, and you're monitoring the quality of that conversation as a whole. So you're managing the time and space, you're practicing active listening, and you're helping transition and guide the conversation, but you are not presenting, right? And you're not telling students how they should answer or taking over the conversation. So let's talk about some of the nuts and bolts of facilitation strategies. Let's talk about, first of all, what doesn't work. And I have tried some of these myself, and so I can verify that they almost always fall flat as far as getting that collective participation that we're aiming for in classroom discussion. Things like cold questioning. This is walking in and without any warm-up, just asking questions either of individual students or of the class as a whole, right? You kind of get that Bueller effect where perhaps you're going to get the one person who raises their hand and participates, but it's not going to facilitate that deep student interaction that we're looking for. Questions that are posed as you want your students to be mind readers, you want them to guess what you're thinking, right? That's not the point of a well-structured classroom discussion, nor is forced agreement. So posing questions such as, well, but shouldn't we all agree that such and such? That's restricting, and that kind of goes along with, students are very attuned with, what does the professor want me to say? What viewpoint are they trying to get me to adopt? And that should not be the goal of your classroom discussion for learning purposes. Really broad questions, such as, what do you think about the reading, right, are pretty much guaranteed to fall flat. This is because this is very broad, it's very open-ended. Think about discussion as a way, certainly, to cultivate deeper thinking about reading, but to not just ask the open-ended questions, but to get students to take a deeper dive into the reading. So you want to structure those questions carefully and not leave them that open-ended. Questions that foreclose, such as, since I have explained this, it should already be clear. Do you have any questions, right? That you're probably not going to get any questions. And rhetorical questions don't really promote effective discussion. We could probably add a few more here. These are kind of a top list of ones that pretty much fall flat if you're looking at intentional discussion to get at those student learning outcomes. So let's talk about some strategies that do work, okay? Again, I want to acknowledge that there are a lot of strategies out there. Certainly, you probably have some that aren't on this list that you may have tried and used. The thing that I want you to take away from this is that you do have a menu of strategies to choose from. But first, you want to start with what's the purpose. Then you want to think about yourself as a facilitator and what communication behaviors you need to adopt to be an effective facilitator. And then you're thinking about, okay, what strategies would make sense, right? Don't just jump to, well, I want to do a gallery walk, but then let me figure out why. Why would I do that? You want to start with the why, and then you get down to this level of thinking about, okay, now I know why I'm doing this. I have a purpose. I understand what I need to do. What strategies would make sense? So strategies for actually getting students to discuss can range from high prep in terms of what you need to do as a teacher to lower prep strategies that doesn't make them better or worse. They just serve different purposes. So things on the high prep list include what I talked about, a gallery walk, which this is where you would have prompts posted around the room, perhaps with flip chart paper or on whiteboards, and students walk around, they answer those prompts, they process that in small groups and large groups, it gets them moving. But there's some thought and setup that goes into that. As with debate, and in particular talking about difficult or controversial issues is something that you want to put a lot of thought and intention into how you want to structure that. And there are excellent resources on that. I'm happy to provide you with more if that's something that you're interested in. Fishbowl strategies have to do with having a small group of students, perhaps even two, participate in a discussion while the rest of the class watches, and then they switch out those roles. Having students generate discussion questions, that requires some forethought ahead of time. It also requires you to model and explain the criteria for what those discussion questions need to look like. Having them engage in role play, having them engage in interviewing one another. There's all kinds of cool things you can do to get them discussing that require a little more thought and preparation. There are also lower prep strategies that still require thought and preparation, but just not quite as much planning. This one is tried and true, think, write, pair, share. This is the opposite of what I talked about in the previous slide of cold questioning, right? So this is where you give students a chance to warm up, to enter into the topic individually by writing a short reflection. You give them the prompt or the discussion question. They pair with a partner in small groups. They talk about it. And then you process and have them report out as a collective. And you can figure out different strategies for how to do that. That's a much better way to warm the class up and get them talking. It also invites a range of participation styles, because not all of our students are comfortable with, and a lot of them actually have apprehension with raising their hand and being the first one to speak out. And so this warms that up for them. Concept mapping can also be, it can be both a low prep and a high prep strategy, but if you have a particularly difficult concept or perhaps a chronological period that you've been talking about or a body of theories that you've been talking about, and you want students to visually map out what that looks like in relationships among those concepts. Again, you can use whiteboard, flip chart to do that, get them discussing, and have them present on that to the class. And then small group discussions are also a good way to facilitate classroom discussion that makes it more manageable than facilitating among 30, 40 students, whatever the case might be. All right, so those are just a few strategies. Again, you can search for classroom discussion strategies and find many, many more. I'm happy to talk to you if you have more ideas on this or want other ideas for how to reach your discussion goals. But just remember that it always goes back to that. You start with the goals before you get here to the strategies. The other thing that I'll say on this is that it's important to use variation. So some of these require more class time, obviously. Some you can do, 10 to 15 minutes, think, write, pair, share exercises. A gallery walk is going to require a lot more time, so that's maybe not something you would use often, but you can vary. You don't have to stick to one strategy, depending on what your goals for the day are. All right, so we've talked about structuring an effective discussion, and we've talked about practicing competent facilitation techniques. Let's talk briefly about developing students as facilitators. I believe that if you are committed to incorporating classroom discussion as a teaching strategy, there's ample opportunity then to also involve students in that facilitation process, and it makes sense to do so for a couple of reasons. One of the things that I talk about in my classroom is that students entering into organizational life, if they leave their college career and they take a job, or even if they're working in a volunteer position, or whatever the case might be, the ability to facilitate a group of people and facilitate a conversation and keep it moving forward is one that's going to make them shine. That's one that I feel strongly they should develop. And so you can take this and you can situate that as specific to your discipline as you want to be. So if you can think of authentic situations that your students might be in that would require them to use those competent facilitation skills, share that with them. Talk about why this is important. And so if you're using classroom discussion and competent facilitation skills, you are teaching them those skills and you're providing examples. You need to point out that that's what you're doing, and you need to point out that you're modeling that effective facilitation for them. If you develop an assignment for them to facilitate class periods or portions of class periods or small group discussions, give them an opportunity to develop a facilitation plan and to receive feedback on that. That does not have to come from you. That can be in class, a peer-to-peer. Let's talk about our facilitation plan and give feedback on that before we actually engage in the facilitation. Make sure that your expectations and criteria are clear for what you want students to learn by engaging in the facilitation and what you want them to actually do. Do not just throw it out there that they're going to lead discussion one day without any of those clear expectations. And hopefully after having talked through this process of how you do it yourself, it becomes more clear of this is also the information that students need to know is good discussions don't just happen, right? They're structured, they're intentional. And then finally, allow for self and peer assessment on the process. So allow them to reflect upon what did they learn from engaging in facilitation, what areas do they want to grow, what did they learn from the discussion itself, and also have their peers participate in that process. So this can be a real learning and growth opportunity for students. I've also found limited example here, but I have found in students I've worked with that they don't always get these opportunities to enact the facilitator role. They've probably had more opportunities to be a presenter and engage in that type of public speaking event, but not in the type of public speaking event that requires facilitation skills. And so that's something to think about as you go forward with adopting classroom discussion into your classroom practice. Okay, so we are out of time. These 30-minute webinars go rather quickly. I once again just want to say thank you for participating today. I hope you feel like you gained some insight into how to use discussion as an intentional strategy in your classroom, both to further student learning and that deeper engagement with the content area, but also to help them develop their communication competencies. So we talked about structuring discussion, we talked about facilitating, and then we talked about developing students as facilitators and taking advantage of that opportunity. There are also many other issues around classroom discussion that we could talk about. We've really just done tip of the iceberg here. So I encourage you to reach out to CXC, either myself, my colleague Heather Bastian, Associate Director of CXC, would be more than happy to talk with you one-on-one if you have any questions or if you want to share thoughts and ideas, feedback with us. We would welcome that. We have another webinar coming up in December that will be on incorporating peer review and peer feedback into your classroom. We hope you can join us for that. Thank you. Have a great day.